Welcome back to another episode of the Twin Elements podcast, proudly presented by Venture Hunting and Outdoors. If you're like us and passionate about hunting, spearfishing, and many other outdoor-related pursuits, with an eagerness to fast-track your learning, then this podcast is perfect for you. G'day legends, and welcome back to another episode of the Twin Elements podcast. So today's episode wraps up what was an epic month of hunting in the USA, with limited days remaining and a mule deer tag still burning in my pocket. We try and focus and get a few stalks in on some mule deer bucks. As always, we will conclude the show with a couple of your listener FAQs, which we've had sent in over the last month while we've been away. If you guys have a question, please email us at info@twinelements.com.au. Please also just add in the subject outline FAQ. That will just help us direct them and facilitate storing them and whatnot. And if you guys don't want to email us and just simply want to send us a DM through social media, just chuck us a message either at Twin Elements, Ayden Doumtsis Outdoors, or James Doumtsis Outdoors, and we will get them and receive them and then answer them there. And if they're worthy of being featured for other people on the podcast, then we'll make sure to do that as well. So, alrighty, without further ado, let's jump into the podcast.
A good backpack turns hard country into possible country. When the terrain gets serious, your pack becomes the only thing you can't afford to get wrong. That's why we use and believe in stock. stock has been making backpacks for 40 years and is trusted by tens of thousands of hunters and hikers worldwide. Their customizable packs and bino harnesses show exquisite attention to detail and years of refinement to make the ultimate backpack range. We use the Vapor 2500 for our day hunts and Vapor 5000 for our backpack hunts. If you're in the market for a new pack or bino harness, check out Venture Hunting and Outdoors in-store or online to see the full range of stock gear. You won't be disappointed.
So, taking a specific focus on mule deer. The last few podcasts, as you would have heard, we've been chasing sharp-tailed grouse, hunting for coyotes, searching for elk high and low in the mountains of Montana. And as you would have heard in last week's podcast, specifically elk heartbreak, we've been amongst elk. James has an elk tag remaining, and mule deer, on the other hand, have been extremely elusive. And I guess, to be honest, that statement's probably not totally fair. We've been seeing plenty of mule deer does, as well as young forky bucks. Yet, to be honest, any bucks with any sort of maturity, something that I probably envisioned as like a target buck heading over to America in the first place, those bucks of any sort of age that we're after have been rarer than hen's teeth. So, to this point in the adventure, James has filled his tag on a mule deer or a deer. We have the combo tag, so we're able to hunt either whitetail or mule deer. And just because of where we are, we haven't really seen many whitetail bucks, let alone anything of any maturity. So mule deer have definitely been the target species. And as I was just suggesting and saying then, James has filled his tag on what was actually a pretty neat 4-point mule deer buck. Honestly, it's one of the better bucks that we've seen over the 20 odd days of hunting. And to be honest, like having got that buck out of the way early with so many other tags to fill was a bit of a luxury, just because it meant that moving forward, any, mule deer that we'd seen that we wanted to stalk was pretty much my stalk. There was no ifs, buts, or, questioning who was going to go and have that hunt. Mule deer or deer in general now fell to me with the last of the deer tags remaining. And from my understanding, September can be a bit of a tricky time to find bucks for a number of reasons, especially what we were seeing on the ground. And I think part of that, mostly can be contributed to that most bucks have sort of shed their velvet, stripped their velvet, and they're leaving their, tendencies and habits that they've formed over the last few months while they were in velvet, where they would bachelor it up with other bucks. So in addition to this, in September, those bucks aren't yet rutting. They're not actually chasing does. And the peak of the rut, in most places in America or the US, aren't actually until November, when it starts to cool down a bit and day length decreases and those does start cycling. So again, September sort of leaves these bucks in a bit of a tricky spot where they're no longer out in the open, fattening up, putting on condition while they're in velvet, trying to avoid that thick scrub, using the ability to bachelor mob up and stay away from predators and stay pretty safe. They're now stripped their velvet. They're not yet rutting and sort of, I guess, naive and a bit maybe silly, and putting themselves in silly situations like when they are in full rut. So they're kind of, mostly anyway, from our observations, the bucks are sort of hiding out in quiet areas, often away from like all the does, and in some instances they're with like one or two other bucks, but most of the time they're sort of by themselves, and that's sort of what we tended to find over the last few weeks. So to this point, we're going to jump back into September 29th. This is our 26th hunting day, and as I said earlier, we're currently 4 out of 6 tags filled. So keeping that in mind, with only a couple of days left of our hunting trip ahead of us before heading home, we're going to try and maximize opportunity. So we'd sort of shifted from trying to target, a mature deer to pretty much any buck that gave us an opportunity for a hunt or for a stalk was now going to have a bit of a target on his back. So as I said, 26 hunting day, up on the mountain at daylight. This is another early morning up high on this particular ridge where we'd been seeing quite a few deer over the last few weeks, and we could pretty much glass a huge amount of country. And to be honest, we'd started loosely dialing down where the bucks were moving, to and from. And we'd edge closer and closer and closer to this private land that we didn't actually have access to in an attempt to try and cut them off as they were moving from where they would feed to where they would ultimately go on bed. And we were sort of losing them in that transition period. So nearly immediately in the grey light, we spied a mob of around probably 4 or 5 young bucks. We could tell they were pretty young through the spotting scope. None of them had really impressive antlers or body size that separated them from any does or anything like that, which was a bit of a giveaway when trying to look for those big bucks, is that they had sort of another third body size compared to these younger deer. So we weren't in too much of a rush to get there, but we did watch them feeding, jostling, playing around with each other, and we kept a mental note on where they were and where they were sort of heading to. And slowly over the next probably hour or two, we continued glassing. We put the spotting scope away after that first 20 minutes of light. And after not finding another mature buck, we started sort of hunting our way there towards these young bucks, not spying anything more mature on the way there. And again, probably an hour or two later, we'd made that mile or so to where they were moving to, probably a mile and a half actually, by the time we'd factored in that they'd moved a little bit. And we started heading down this ridge line, and finally I was able to spot a forky buck and another young buck. I think it was like a 3x3 feeding sort of on this ridge top. And pretty easily, with the lay of the land and the topography, James and I were able to close into about 35 yards. And to be honest, at this point, it was probably like the second or third last day of hunting. And I'd said to myself, if one of these young bucks offered a shot, I would take it. But as luck would have it, with the way those two animals were sort of feeding up along the ridge, sort of paralleling us, a shot never offered. Plus, there was such a steep sort of drop away behind them. I just wasn't comfortable in the shot, even though it was only 35 yards. I just couldn't get a clear view of his vitals as they were sort of somewhat silhouetted on the other side of the ridge. So they ended up feeding over, and I'm pretty sure they'd fed over and were going to just bed down given the time of the morning. So James and I elected, rather than to try and keep, forcing the issue and try and get closer and closer and closer and skyline ourselves, did a big loop, got the wind even more perfect, and changed angles, and we were able to sneak back around and sort of relocate these bucks. And in fact, they had bedded probably 100 yards from where we'd last seen them. And it had now been about 20 minutes, but we were able to see them at about 100 yards. And pretty quickly, I ditched the boots and the pack and, had let James know, you stay here where you can see them at 100. I'm just going to drop down here and try and get into the closest cover, which, using the lay of the land, I was able to get into about 40 yards. Anyway, my mindset at this time, and to be honest, for the whole part of the last bit of the trip, I don't know if it was a bit of just fatigue and maybe not being 100% committed because I'd already achieved quite a lot leading up to this point by shooting the elk and the pronghorn, or if it wasn't maybe the fact that we weren't seeing a mature mule deer that really got the blood pumping. But make no mistake, I was there to kill a buck and I would have shot one of these young bucks, but I guess I wasn't desperate for it. And I was more probably letting things come to me. And in this example, after probably 10 minutes of sitting off these young bucks at like 35, 40 meters, I actually said, we've got nothing to lose. Like if one of these young bucks, were to see us or wind us, or, in the process of trying to get James to come down from 100 meters away to come down to 40 with me where he could video over the shoulder, if we get busted or hurt or something like that, I'm not going to be too disappointed. And to be honest, I'm glad we called James down because he came down, joined me, got a little bit of footage at 40 meters, and probably after 2 or 3 minutes, I think he ended up getting busted by one of these young bucks, probably the glare of the camera at such close range, or one of the bucks might have just shifted their weight, stood up, and then seen him. Whatever it was, like in limited cover with 2 of us there at 40 yards, these young bucks, ultimately, they took off. And as to be expected, we'd seen the 2 bucks on the top of the ridge, just move over and bed down. But when they took off, I think there was 4 or 5 bucks, as we'd sort of seen earlier that morning from a long range away. And anyway, not to be too concerned, but James and I went back to the packs and put our boots on, did, the little walk of shame where we do that, which happens most of the time when hunting mule deer, I'm afraid. And anyway, we sort of moved off in the same direction that the bucks took off because they'd ran with the wind, and that's the direction we wanted to be hunting. And to be honest, we wanted to be looking this particular morning with the way the wind was going. We had the wind in our face, but we're also looking into the western-facing slopes of the sort of break country that we were hunting, where the shade was. And that was the strategy for these mule deer, is that they would basically bed down on the edge of these really tight quarter sort of cliffs and ravines, sometimes in little cracks and crevices that you couldn't even imagine a deer slipping into. But they were chasing wherever the shade was because temperatures were sort of up in the 90-degree mark Fahrenheit, which is around 30 degrees Celsius. So anyway, a little bit of time has moved on and it's now getting towards lunchtime, and pretty quickly, once we sort of refound ourselves, moved around, got to a position where we could glass again in the next little basin, we quickly re-identified some mule deer, and it turned out, as far as I'm concerned, to be the same mob. Like a few of those young bucks had pretty unique sort of antlers, being very upright, like 3x3s, and just the same 4 or 5 deer. But interestingly, probably about 100 meters away from where they were bedded, obviously chasing those same bedding characteristics on the same sort of hillside or slopes with the shade, they did have what was a young forky mule deer amongst this mob. And what was pretty cool about this buck is that it was super unique. So one of his antlers was a hard sort of normal single spike that then splits into a fork, or like a little fishtail at the top, which we were commonly calling a little forky buck. But the other side was somewhat like almost like a drop tine that you see a lot here in Australia with rooster deer. But what was pretty cool and unique about this drop tine is the fact that it was actually like more of a pendulous sort of floppy velvet sort of appendage, I guess, to the side of his other like antler. And there was no hard spike there. So I don't know whether he was in velvet growing his first set of antlers, damaged that side, and now it's just like this remnant sort of pendulous floppy necrotic looking sort of antler. It's still a bit of velvet. But it made him pretty unique, and you could see him whenever he got up and stood from his bed, he'd like shake it like a dog trying to get, water droplets off them after they'd been for a swim. And he was pretty cool, but that was a bit short-lived because, to be honest, we ended up getting winded by them. Unfortunately, the wind swirled, which was a bit of a common occurrence over the last few weeks, and that sort of, pushed those bucks off before we even had a chance to stalk them. And we are proud to introduce Carnivore Collective, supplying some of the best meat processing gear in Australia. If you're a complete hunter who loves the benefit of being responsible for harvesting your own meat, then listen up. Take control of the whole field to freezer process with gear from Carnivore Collective. The team have absolutely everything you need. We've been running their number 32 mincer, and honestly, it's a beast. That's it. That's all you need to know. This thing chews through venison, pork, and whatever wild game meat I throw at it. It's the best mincer I've ever used, churning out over 70 kilograms of meat into mince in less than 30 minutes. But the number 32 mincer is just a start. Carnivore Collective also has saws, vacuum sealers, dehydrators, sausage fillers, jerky gear, sausage spice mixers, seasoned rubs, and more. Literally the full end-to-end range for anyone serious about producing high-quality wild game meats at home. And the best part? Carnivore Collective has set up an exclusive offer for you, our listeners, Simply use code TWIN10 at checkout for 10% off your order. If you want to check out their range in person, then Venture Hunting is now stocking Carnivore Collective products in store and online. What we ended up doing was just continuing, basically. We didn't really have any other options because the way that the wind was blowing that day and the way that the shade was, it's like we could only really keep traveling in that direction. So we just continued hunting, and eventually we were rewarded with our glassing and covering countryside by finding a handy sort of 3x3 buck. And I know I said the other ones were 3x3, but the difference between a 3x3 with a bit of maturity and a 3x3 that's like 2 or 3 years old is a very stark difference. As I said earlier, like these mature deer or somewhat mature, they just have a different character, like presence to them. They're a lot more solid. Their antlers are generally a lot thicker and heavier. And again, this buck wasn't particularly like an old mature buck, but he was on the verge of that. Like he was on the verge of being a deer that was sort of something that I envisaged as wanting to take heading into this trip. So I definitely had a keenness about this stalk, especially considering that he was like a clear step above everything that we'd been seeing over the past few days for sure. So James and I, again, dropped the packs and devised a bit of a plan to come in, around and on top of the buck. So that led to me dropping down. I actually positioned James pretty much where we'd dropped the packs, where he had a good view of the whole basin and could video the buck and then me coming in. And I pretty much dropped down this big draw that we're on, and I had to sort of drop down, regain elevation, and then come up along the same ridge that the buck was sort of bedded underneath. And I managed to stalk in and get to around 60 meters from where I thought the buck was. And then I could finally, after a bit of searching and sort of using Onyx and where I thought he was and just trying to use some landmarks in this sort of country, was able to see his antlers. And while I was up there getting a bit of a range through the Leopold rangefinders, I was sort of sitting there and the wind kept coming across like my left side of my cheek towards the buck that was on the right. And I was getting a bit worried that if I kept going, closing the distance from 60 to 50 to 40 to 30 to try and get a shot, that eventually I was going to get undone by the wind. Like it just wasn't consistent enough for me. And having just been winded by those other young bucks, I kind of sat there and contemplated that I was having the wrong approach, even though for most of the morning that was the right approach. So with the way he was facing, again, I wasn't convinced the wind would sort of hold for as long as I needed to get within 30. So I ended up backing out, going all the way back down towards where James was and where I'd just come from, recrossed the gully, came back around from another direction. And to be honest, to get completely out of the buck's line of sight from where he was bedding, I had to do what was like a near 1 mile loop. And where I sort of stuffed up was that I'd left the pack and my boots and stuff back up where James was. So probably an hour had gone by where I hadn't had any water, was pretty uncomfortable walking through all this prickly pear and desert cactus and harsh rocky sort of country. And to be honest, I hadn't had water for some portion of time now. So, and again, being pretty much like just after lunch, the hottest part of the day, it was pretty stifling and hot. So fortunately, one thing that kept me going was obviously the fact that I had this pretty good buck in front of me that I was trying to make tracks for. And I'd marked the buck's location on Onyx, but was also using a pretty distinct sort of shrub or like little bush that I'd marked was pretty much above the buck and where I wanted to come in on using that line that I'd sort of picked out earlier from the other side of the hill. So, and I know you're saying, oh, what shrub, what bush, how distinctive is it? And this prairie sort of country that we're hunting is almost desert-like. So any bush or shrub that's bigger than like a meter in size is super, super distinctive. And to be honest, as soon as I got up and around, I was like, oh, there's a bush, and was able to go in. And sure enough, it matched and, translated to where I had a rough Onyx pin. And then sure enough, I was able to obviously see the buck shortly thereafter. But what was most important is that from this new angle of approach, I'd cut the distance pretty quickly because I was out of view of the buck and I had a much better breeze now. And I was able to get into 45 meters with ease. And the wind, as I said, was far, far better. And I'd already been able to cut sort of 15 meters off effectively from 60 meters on the other side, if you remember from earlier in the story. So even at this distance, though, I'd sort of maxed out where I could get to just because he was on one side of a sharp ravine and I was on the other. So I still wasn't happy with the distance. And again, being outside my shooting range on an animal of this size, being a mule deer, plus with no real vertical cover except for that bush, which I'd sort of like left behind me on the ridge. I ended up deciding to sort of loop back around back to that bush and try and look for like another option to get closer. And with a bit of assessment, looking on X and looking at sort of the countryside before me, I was able to like back out, slightly come around, and then come down a bit more of a finger that was just up to my right. And doing this, I sort of was able to stay behind enough of the countryside and stay out of sight of this buck. So what I did was use his antlers, which I could now see pretty easily, as a bit of a marker for his alertness. And I kind of knew which way he was facing. And if I saw his antlers shift or move at all, then I'd obviously, take into account that maybe his ears and eyes were scanning or looking or were changing direction. But as currently constructed, the buck was bedded and I was using these rocks and the hill that was before me to sort of cover his eyes and ears. So I pretty slowly etched around, had to go up and then drop down, and I was able to drop down a little bit further onto this finger, as I just said, and I got to 35 meters undetected, was able to range the buck now and where he was sitting, and ranged it at 35 meters, and I put an arrow on the string, and pretty much from there just proceeded to wait off the buck, very, very similarly to sort of what we do with the chital deer back home. You spend a lot of time doing the actual stalk and approach and getting things right, and then it's just waiting for that animal to stand. And again, being the middle of the day, I was sort of in for it. I didn't know if he'd just re-bedded half an hour ago, or even when I did my big loop, if he'd got up and bedded down again. So as far as I was concerned, I could have been sitting there for 2 hours. But unfortunately, where this hunt sort of took a bit of a turn for the worse was after about 5 minutes or so of sitting off the buck, not moving, the wind's sort of perfect. What happened next was pretty unexpected. So I actually noticed this little chipmunk feeding sort of down below me in the draw. And if you can picture the draw that we're hunting, it's sort of me on one edge of like a cup. If you imagine like just a mug that you're drinking from, I'm on the right-hand side edge. That cup drops down all the way to the bottom of the cup. Down in the bottom, if you can imagine where you'd have your coffee and your liquid and whatever, just say there's a bit of shrubs, a bit of grass, a bit of, vegetation, because that's where it's shaded and it survives the sun. This little chipmunk crawled out of there, and the buck for me was directly opposite me 30 yards, pretty much on the same height, but it was 30 yards of like missing ground. Like it was basically, like I said, that cup or V-shaped. He was on the other side of the ravine. And anyway, I pictured this silly little chipmunk feeding up and out of the draw towards me. And at first, I thought it was a bird because I hadn't really seen that many chipmunks on this hunt, and there were plenty of small little birds running around the prairie and scattering around and things. And the way this, animal scurried along the open ground, it looked sort of out of place. And anyway, when it got to around 5 meters away from me is when it finally noticed that I was there and not part of the landscape, and it started sounding off its alarm. And for anyone that hasn't heard a chipmunk, they have this little chittering sort of noise and you can hear it from miles away, and immediately my worst fear sort of occurs. And I was watching that buck and his antlers started turning from sort of facing away, which I was using as a metric for the last 5 minutes or so, and it started doing a 180. And basically I could see that buck, without looking at his eyes or ears because they were still hidden, that he was still like facing now my direction. Like I could see the tops of his antlers facing towards me. I could nearly even see his eye guards, but I couldn't see his ears or eyes still. So I know that there's no way that he's actually seen me specifically, but I know that he is now reacting to the chipmunk's alarm calls very much in my close proximity. Like that chipmunk was around 5 meters from me. What did happen is that the chipmunk continued doing its little call, but it sort of ran back down the draw, which I think was probably bought me a little bit of time. But what happened next was that buck unfortunately stood up, and he was very much like cautious and alert. And at first he was sort of looking below me down into the draw where the chipmunk had just run to. But then very slowly, and you'll be able to see this in the footage, like it's pretty heartbreaking, but that buck sort of just starts like looking around its surroundings and gradually coming up and bringing its head from like looking downhill to like level and then slightly uphill to where like as if just like someone's shone lights on it, sort of like, a stage light on it. He's kind of just gone, oh shit, there's something there. And that buck shifted its gaze up towards me and just pinpointed me, and there was nothing I could do. Like I was tucked up into the shade as best I could be. I wasn't skylined like with the open ridge line behind me or anything like that. Yet, as I said, that odd sort of vertical shape that I was in a treeless environment must have stood out like a sore thumb. And that buck pretty quickly, after pinpointing where I was, bounded away over the skyline and was never seen again, unfortunately. And yeah, that stalk, as likely as it felt, was over sort of before it really even began. As I said, just with the fact that those bucks sometimes will be bedded for 2 or 3 hours and you got to wait for them to stand. And even if they stand, they might not present you a shot. But the fact that it had sort of abruptly ended in that fashion was a bit disheartening. And the fact that it was late afternoon, we didn't unfortunately get another opportunity on a buck that day. So to match, I guess very much the trend of the week, the next day was sort of the same. We'd seen a few does, no real bucks that were targets or shooters or anything like that. And to be honest, it was just very, very quiet. Like with hot weather and limited opportunities on the deer, despite the effort that we put in, we were sort of heading into our last available day pretty disheartened.
Very rare nowadays that something comes into our hunting arsenal and completely revolutionises how we do something. But the Walk and Stalk game bar and lift kit has done just that. This combination has taken our field butchering to the next level. The game bar has 7 features, including a trekking pole, drag bar, shooting sticks, bino attachments, and so much more. The lift kit or pulley system filled a massive hole I always saw in the market. A lightweight system weighing in at only 270 grams that could fit in your pack but strong enough to lift a 200 kilo animal off the ground, leading to easier butchering and better meat care. It's a piece of equipment that every hunter needs. Check out Walk and Stalk on their website, www.walkandstalkstore.com, and use code TWIN15 to get 15% off your order.
So as I was sort of saying there, that brings us to October 1st, which is our hunting day at number 28 of this 2025 USA trip. And this was our last day of hunting. In fact, it was sort of a half day. It was not even meant to be or constructed to be a day, as we had to sort of leave where we were actually hunting at midday at the latest, just to get back to Bozeman, Montana, which is sort of where we had some gear and we were getting picked up from to go to the airport and then ultimately return home to Australia. So fortunately for us, we, as we always do, try and make the most of the hunting time. And with tags still burning in our pockets, we didn't want to just give up and finish up on the last day of September. We used that half day on October 1st. And as I said, fortunately for us, we're up glassing early. And we were sort of on a spot where we'd actually been seeing, mostly the bull elk, because James obviously had an elk tag. And just the fact that we weren't really seeing many mule deer, we sort of thought, well, with James and I both having tags remaining, we'll try and go to a spot where we're a chance to see, a bull elk or even a buck. And right on first light, we're able to spot a young buck. And I pretty much from that point just kept tabs on him while James sort of surveyed the landscape looking for a bull or a spike, because I believe a spike was eligible to be hunted legally with the tag that we had as well. So in all honesty, we were hunting an area where we had seen elk, where the mobs were earlier in the trip that we were hunting primarily. But as we said in the previous podcast, like with a bit of hunting pressure, warmer weather, all this type of stuff, as the season went on, these animals simply were no longer there. And we didn't actually see an elk that morning, but we did, as I said, see that mule deer. So as the morning progressed, and I just kept tabs on that deer, every time he would go into a draw, I'd get a little bit nervous if I'd be able to re-see him sort of resurface. But I did, and after rechecking multiple times that there weren't any elk around, eventually I watched as this young buck bedded down in a small shaded draw where I could just see him on the edge of this little lip. So it was now probably 9 a.m, I'd say, and wasting little time, James and I sort of devised a plan to loop back around the top of this basin and then drop down off the top of the break country and sort of stalk down in on this young mule deer buck. So that was our best lead, our only lead at this point. This was essentially our last stalk of our USA trip. So as I said earlier, there's no tomorrow, no looking for another buck later today. This is it. This is the last stalk from our 28 days of hunting. So This stalk, in all honesty, from this point, from what I could tell, was pretty easy, like especially initially. So roughly from around 3/4 of a mile away from this young buck, I was able to get to within around 50 meters of where I thought he was pretty quickly. Like the wind was good, the thermals were good, using onyx quite a lot, plus a few large sort of rocks and little outcrops that I used as markers from up high on the ridgeline. I was able to get a pretty good idea of where I thought this young buck was. And again, with some careful steps, forward, now without a pack or without boots, and just constantly glassing the edges of this little draw system that I thought he was in, I was eventually able to spot the buck's antlers and realize that he was still bedded exactly where I'd left him, very much where Onyx sort of suggested he was. So what was good was that the wind was great. As I said, the thermals by this stage of the morning weren't sucking downhill, which was good. They were sucking up towards me because I was in the exposed bright sunlight on an open ridgeline or an open sort of face. And I was able to sneak in using some of the sagebrush that was on this flat as a bit of cover. And to be honest, it was one step in front of the other with socks, as I said. And one of my strategies for stalking this buck was because there was just so limited cover and he could have got up at any point in time and I might have had to be ready to shoot. I always kept my left foot forwards and sort of went left foot, right, brought my right foot back to where the back of my left was, extended my left foot out forward again, crept my right foot back up and caught up. And then that way, in that theory, which is something that I encourage a lot of bow hunters to sort of identify as a good strategy, especially when you're stalking in close to animals, is that I can always draw back the bow and be planted evenly with, my shooting foot sort of forward, if that makes sense. So I just continued that process of left foot forward, right foot catch up, left foot forward, right foot catch up. And I was able to sneak with the bow in front of my face to around 26 meters from that buck pretty easily because I was just using his antlers as a gauge, again, as to which way he was looking, if he was alert, moving, any of that type of stuff. And at the same time that I started getting closer and got to 26 yards, the buck himself had sort of begun to shift his weight and move his antlers around a bit more, something that it's a trait that with antlered animals you can notice a little bit easier, but all deer do it, especially like here in Australia with chittle deer. I notice it quite a lot when there's a lot of flies agitating them or the sun sort of starts hitting bucks because they're bedded in a spot first, like thing in the morning where they were initially in the shade, but because the shade moves so quickly up until lunchtime, they're now, 45 minutes later, no longer in the shade. And what they want to do is they start getting a little bit agitated, shifting their antlers, and that sort of indicates that they're likely to stand from this first bed and move at some stage forward. So again, from his initial time of bedding, when I first saw him from like up on my initial vantage point up on the hill, it had probably been about 40 minutes from closing that 3/4 of a mile down to 26 meters. So the timing for him to sort of, exhibit this behavior and rebed and find a better shade was pretty accurate. There was also every chance that he might have just got up, turned around and bedded down facing the opposite way just to hide his head and his antlers a bit more from the shade. Like the bed he was in, on reflection was definitely a good bed. It was carved into that cave on the edge of the draw. So he was pretty content where he was, but there were signs that he was about to get up. So with an arrow on the string, I waited, had my release aid clipped onto the D loop, everything pretty much like tight, ready to go. It was just, waiting for this buck to stand. And eventually, maybe a minute or two later, he does that very thing and stands. And as he did, I saw how he presented and I drew the bow back while his head was sort of covered by the bank. Like he stood up and didn't initially look around straight away. He sort of like was almost hunched over, looking down towards where his front feet were. So what's sort of pretty ironic, I guess, is that same little bit of sage that I was sort of using earlier to get into 26 yards and use as a bit of a cover to conceal me from this buck, and probably what got me or allowed me to get to full draw without him seeing me straight away, was now actually preventing me from shooting him because, as I said, I'm at 26 yards. He'd stood up sort of on a broadside, slightly quartering to position. And the only thing that stopped me from shooting is that exactly where I had my pin on his vitals, there was this pretty solid bit of sagebrush. So I was sort of forced to wait. I did have, for a second there, the thought to sort of, I guess, force things and potentially sort of like move out a little bit, try and take a step and just increase that angle and be able to shoot him and like avoid that sagebrush. But I also thought it's so quiet. It's not super like windy. It is, the wind has been consistent, but it's not like a noise cancelling wind. I'm pretty close. I've got no other vertical cover that if I move an inch here, that this buck's going to see me. And I just continued hovering my pin over the right spot, waiting for that buck to pretty much just, either scratch, take a step forward, take a step backwards, do whatever. Even if he got up, rebedded, and was never able to shoot because he didn't present a shot, I would have been happy with that. But at least at this point, I'm ready to go. I'm doing the best I can. And I don't know, I must have, in retrospect, been at full draw for probably around 30 to 45 seconds at this point, 35, 40 seconds, I'd say, when the buck suddenly turned his head from sort of downhill, looking down the draw, and immediately just picks me out uphill to his right, sort of, as I said. And to be honest, I was pretty shocked. I'm looking at all of this through the peep. Like, I hadn't moved an inch. That pin for me had just been hovering over where I thought it needed to be. And to be honest, as I said, that little bit of sagebrush had given me what I thought was enough cover to where obviously I didn't think the buck could see me and I couldn't shoot in hindsight. But at the same time, I could only imagine that the way the buck sort of acted and how quick he turned his head, that potentially the top cam of my bow, now that I'm at full draw, might have been visible and potentially maybe a little bit shiny or something that the buck must have picked out above that bit of a sagebrush. And when he sort of turned just to check out his surroundings, he turned his head on a swivel and just found me and found that, odd shape incredibly quickly. Like, the tendency for animals to just pick things out from their environment that shouldn't be there is what keeps them alive. And we continued this stare down at full draw for a few seconds thereafter. But to be honest, it was at this point in my heart, I knew that this stalk was done. And again, I continued watching the buck through the peep with my pin settled, but again, I couldn't shoot through that brush, and especially not at an alert buck. And finally, after around 90 seconds from when I first drew back the bow, he had filled his curiosity and eventually got unsettled enough to the point where he just dropped straight off the lip of that bank, took off running down into the draw, and was never to be seen again, unfortunately. So, it's pretty heartbreaking that after 28 days, that's sort of how my mule deer hunting saga ended. And it's, as simple as one step either way, and he would have presented a shot and likely been in grave danger. All that was left was for me to basically put an arrow through the vitals and a shaving sharp, Cayuga broadhead cross day 6 shaft through the boiler room. But as we know, all too well, that's how bow hunting goes. And unfortunately, his keen eyesight and just, a sense that something was wrong kept him alive in that instant. So having the hunt end like that was pretty disappointing for sure. But as I was sort of alluding to earlier, in all honesty, the fact that it was a young buck and probably not an old mature mule deer, one of those old crusty sort of 4x4s that you see in a lot of these hunting films, part of me was sort of not necessarily thankful that it ended that way, but definitely content. Like, I wasn't keen on pushing things, if I'm being honest. I wasn't desperate to shoot that buck. Like, with both of my previous elk and my pronghorn from earlier in the trip, there was never a doubt, there was never a hesitation that they were the animals that I wanted to hunt, to kill, to target, to put an arrow through. From the second I embarked on stalking them, my ultimate goal was 100% killing them for me. Like, they were animals that going into the trip, I was like, yes, if I see an animal like that, I want to hunt it. Like, I guess part of it too is that, back home here in Australia, I would say that when I'm not trying to fill the freezer, I'm incredibly picky with, the type of animal and the age class that I try and hunt, more so just for the challenge. And that's obviously taking into account if I've got the benefit of not having to do, population control on the property, or the property owners sort of like those animals. And here in America, where these mule deer, are a native animal, there's other people hunting them constantly. There wasn't that desire to just, go and necessarily kill the animal for just no reason. And, I definitely found myself towards the end of this trip, probably more so using the excuse of trying to get a mule deer buck, any buck on the ground, especially a young buck on the ground and in the freezer, and providing for others as a bit of a reason to probably hunt them. Whereas it was cool from James's perspective, like we were still seeing that really big mature bull, right up until the end of the trip. So I feel like when it was hard for me to try and justify, I guess, putting lots of time into stalking these young mule deer bucks when we were seeing a really good brute of a bull elk. And that's why, you'll see in the films, like there were certain times where, we scare the bull elk and then we're just back there trying to find him the next day, and then back there trying to find him the next day, and then we find him the day after that and we're hunting him again. And it was addictive because it was that animal that, we were trying to hunt. And again, whilst this outcome certainly wasn't what I was after in not being able to take a mule deer buck and, having tag soup, having a tag come home with me in my pocket, the fact that I wasn't able to succeed and get all 3 of my tags filled definitely makes me especially keen to get back to the USA soon and try and get my first mule deer on the deck with archery equipment, especially, just one of those mature bucks. What made this hunt all the sweeter? And again, probably in reflection, like I was definitely dirty that, at 26 yards I got busted, but I was also glad that I was able to respect that animal and not force, a bad shot through the sage just through lust and desire. But where I think, it cemented things for me is that after this hunt, actually I'm walking back towards the car to sort of leave and wrap up the trip, James and I actually stumbled across a deadhead, and this, mule deer that James found, I don't know how long it had been there, still had a bit of a smell to it, so probably from the previous winter, but this buck was just old and gnarly and had mass and age and width, like honestly probably was like 27 inches wide, and probably would have scored like 170s, maybe even 180 inches, which for those that don't know, like a 200-inch mule deer is an absolute giant. Even like half of these mule deer that James and I are talking about stalking are probably like 120, 130. So 170 was truly like the granddad, the old poppy bloody mule deer. So finding him and knowing that he's in that area kind of made me glad that I didn't take the younger buck, and was definitely something to get us keen for next time heading back over to the USA. Hunt and Fool is the foremost hunting resource with varied levels of membership to get you on your next adventure. If you've seen some of our recent USA-based adventures and that's got you thinking about a hunt of your own, then listen up. Whether it be an eagerness towards planning annual trips, or you're more time poor and want to plan towards a bigger, once-in-a-lifetime adventure, you're in the right place. Hunt and Fool and the consultancy team will cater to your needs regardless of your desired hunt. James and I have been utilising their services for a couple of years now, and virtually all of our USA adventures are shaped by the guidance of our friends, the Hunting Fool advisors. Not sure where to start when planning a USA hunt? No problem. Not sure how to apply for tags? No dramas. Simply set a budget and have a general idea of what species you want to hunt, and the team at Hunting Fool will start narrowing the hunt to your preferences. If you're interested in using Hunting Fool's license application services to draw more tags across the Western United States, then email applications@huntandfool.com and start the conversation today. Mention Twin Elements to get 25% off your first year of service. The Hunt and Fool team will take it from there. Alrighty, my friends, it is that time of the show where, to be honest, we haven't answered any FAQs for a few weeks now, just due to the fact and the nature of the semi-live podcasts while we were recording from the USA live in the field. So if you guys have any questions following this podcast, or just a simple curiosity for something hunting or outdoor related and want it answered, or want James or my insight, then please send us an email to info@twinelements.com.au, and please just remember to add in the subject line FAQ. That will just help us sift through the emails. Or if you're more preferred to be on social media, then please simply DM either Twin Elements, Ayden Doumtsis Outdoors, or James Doumtsis Outdoors on socials, and we will strive to answer them firstly there, and then obviously on a future episode of the podcast. So today's first question has been sent in via Instagram user TK Shoot, and TK Shoot says, "Can you please tell me where you get the decoys from, please?" Alrighty. So for those that aren't in the loop or haven't heard, I guess our previous pronghorn podcast, there are a couple podcasts back now. But this question is in relation to the pronghorn hunting that James and I did over in the USA using decoys to bring these pronghorn bucks into range. So this specific decoy that the listener is alluding to was the Fred, I'm probably going to pronounce this incorrectly, but Fred Eichler, which is the name of a person. It's their style antelope buck with quick stand is the description or title of the decoy. So I'll repeat that again. The Fred Eichler, Eichler, antelope buck with quick stand. And James and I, upon arriving in Bozeman, Montana, pretty much headed straight out to the Sportsman's Warehouse, got all of our, jet boil fuel, peak meals, all our dehydrated meals, whatever other stuff we needed for this hunt. And we saw that antelope buck decoy and thought, yep, for, I think it was from memory, like 139 bucks US. So probably around $200 when you convert it to Australian dollars. James and I were like, yep, we're going to get that. We have 2 tags in our pockets, and if it works, then great. If not, whatever. Like, we just want to be able to maximize every opportunity and have the best encounters and best chances in case. Like, for us, $200 might sound like a lot, but when you're over there in the US and, say for us spot and stalk didn't work or ambush hunting on water didn't work, if that decoy even gave us one encounter, then it paid for itself. And as you would have seen and heard in the podcast, that decoy that we purchased for $200 Australian was worth every single penny. Both James and I managed to shoot, a buck each, both of our bucks, utilizing this tactic, and would encourage anyone heading over there with a pronghorn tag during the rut in September to try this decoy style of hunting for themselves. So one thing I will say, obviously during rifle season, there needs to be like an added level of care when decoying by you, the hunter, and people around you. So when you have people in the bush with rifles and you're decoying next to the fake pronghorn buck, just make sure that you are wearing blaze orange, or you put blaze orange on the decoy. Just something like that would make a bit of sense to me, just to make sure that everyone's staying safe, avoiding disasters and accidents, and heading home back to their loved ones while having a bit of fun. I can only picture that, during rifle season, a hunter sees, this, they are super accurate. Like this antelope decoy, like if you saw it from 300 yards away, propped up on the side of a ridge, like sure, they shake a little bit funny in the wind, but if you saw it on a still day, you'd put a bullet through it. So just make sure, obviously with all hunting, you make sure of your target and recognize that it's in fact an animal, an illegal animal, and all those things. I don't want to preach too much here, but just if you are going out there during rifle season, then there is a certain onus on you to make sure that you're doing your best to avoid and not contribute to, as I said, a terrible accident. So that's the first question. The second question for today has been sent in by Gundog Gear on Instagram. That is Gundog Gear, if I said that a little bit quickly earlier. So they have said, "Hey guys, I was wondering how you find iron gate knives ergo skinner for the finer detailed work like caping and getting into tight spots. It looks like you can break down a big game animal no problem. Just wondering how it goes with the finer stuff." So firstly, thanks very much for the question. You guys would have seen we've been posting a lot about the iron gate knives recently on our socials, and if you haven't, make sure you go and check them out. The guys down in Port Stephens do awesome work handcrafting these knives. As stated, this knife can easily handle breaking down a big game animal. I use this particular blade for the heavy lifting on this trip, in fact, mostly skinning, breaking down the animal into quarters, then disarticulating the bony sort of sections and the joints and things. to further break legs into muscle cuts, all that type of stuff. And my bull elk was very quickly and easily broken down. So I use that ergo skinner essentially as just like a small little fixed blade knife to get the meat off the animal, and then into pieces to pack, back to camp in game bags and get everything off the mountain. So when it actually comes to the trophy preparation, as this question sort of more directly asks, I can still do quite a bit of that work. But what I do back home in Australia, more so when I am actually caping out animals, especially like chital deer, I do 90% of the skinning work with the same blade, so with like the ergo skinner. But where I commonly sort of switch from this fixed blade skinning knife to something more fine and sort of delicate like a scalpel or a scalpel blade is after I've actually caped the animal all the way back from like the pizzle in most instances, because I try and do, shoulder mounts, pedestal mounts, whatever it may be. I remove all the skin to the point of the back of the head, disarticulate the head, take the head and full cape back to camp and remove it from the carcass. And then once I'm back at camp or in a cool location back at camp, if I'm like out in the bush remotely, that's when I'll sort of take the scalpel, as I said, and start skinning, the face, turning the lips, doing the eyes, nose, ears, I think I said lips, all that type of stuff. All the finer details is what I'll typically do with the scalpel, if I'm being honest. So as, a chital guide for spotted safaris, this type of stuff is essential that I do it immediately, especially in the heat of North Queensland where it's quite tropical and warm, 30-degree days, and that chital capes and stuff will spoil if I don't do it. But to be honest, that's pretty specific for me as a chital deer guide in those conditions. Whereas if I'm being honest, for a lot of hunters, if most people say you're hunting sambar deer down in Victoria, by simply removing the skull and the cape, from the carcass, putting on your pack with all the meat and then taking that back to camp, getting it in cool conditions to a taxidermist the next day, I think most of the taxidermy work will be able to get done by the taxidermist. Obviously, if you have the skill to continue, breaking it down, turning the eyes, ears, lips, nose, all that type of stuff, getting the skin off the face, then that's going to be beneficial to you. And I definitely encourage all people to just upskill and learn this type of stuff, especially the more you're hunting. But most of that work, even removing the skin from the skull, if you just want to cut weight and then remove the lower jaw, take the antlers back and then the cape sort of folded up separately, you would be able to do that with that ergo skinner for sure. And then just do the finesse, like ear turning and stuff back at camp with something like a scalpel. So I hope that helps. If you haven't, definitely go and check out Iron Gate Knives. I was super, super impressed, as I said, in this little question. I broke down that bull elk with ease using it. We also broke down multiple pronghorn as well as that mule deer buck with James, and we just simply touched it up on a bit of a steel and it was good to go for the next one. We run a mixture of different knives, but the Iron Gate knives are definitely in our kill kit arsenal, and I'd suggest them to anyone serious about getting a handcrafted knife that is going to last generations and generations and is made by some good old-fashioned Australian blokes. So thank you very much, guys, for the questions. Well, friends, that is it for today's podcast. We'll just finish up with a little bit of housekeeping. As you guys are hearing this, our epic 8-part cinematic vlog series, Against All Odds, has just dropped on our YouTube. So some of you guys may remember, in fact, that James, we dropped this cinematic piece about a year ago, to be honest, on our YouTube, and it was greatly received. So this cinematic vlog, as I said, is an 8-part series, and in each episode, it's just simply more thorough. There's an in-depth breakdown of each episode. Each little episode has sort of features of never before seen footage, including little bits of narration from James and just thoughts from the mountains as we hunted and recorded it, in Montana, that James has sort of added to the hunt just to sort of probably give a bit more into the mindset and like decision making of this hunt. Because as I said, that little cinematic piece that we did earlier, like we were in the hills for 21 days, I think, and the cinematic piece goes for about half an hour. So, you've got nearly like a minute per day. So this one's breaking, sometimes days down in 10 minutes. So it's just a lot more in depth, shows you the full hunt, a bit more from where to go. So hopefully you guys enjoy that. And as I said, that's coming out over the next 8 weeks. So we've got plenty of content there. Please subscribe, comment, and like the films. And make sure that you guys are tuning in each Wednesday from 6 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time moving forwards in 2025 to round out the year, as well as into 2026 for all new film drops. After this USA series, we will be releasing an epic film featuring our dad, Ayden Doumtsis, and this hunt takes place in remote and rugged Northern Territory, Australia. We spend some time reflecting with Dad on sort of our hunting journey, how we got into it, what the future looks like, all that type of stuff, whilst also searching for buffalo and boars in the build up to the wet season. So it's stinking hot, but there's some great action, some great wildlife footage as to be expected. Following that film, we continue the momentum with what is set to be probably our best film series ever. This, of course, is a 9-part film series from the 2025 Red Deer Raw, where we feature 3 epic hunts for red deer stags, including my personal best 12-point red stag from Queensland. And then, to be honest, what's wild is that, only a week later, we actually shift back to New South Wales, and I'm able to shoot my new PB, which is an upgrade to that 12-pointer, and I shoot a monster 14-point red stag up close and personal, all on film after calling him in with a seductive hind call. So we've got all that footage. It's super close range, some amazing content that is, has not done the rounds. You guys haven't seen it. We also fill the series out with a bit of fallow deer hunting, some feral pigs, feral goats, much, much more over this epic period, bow hunting the 2025 rut. So get excited for that one. If that's not enough, then we have another 3 films coming your way. We've just got back and done a hunt with Cayuga Adventures in the heart of Cape York, Queensland, Australia. And up there, we basically join the lads and hunt some insane hooky boars, taking some exceptional hogs, all again from close range, as we sort of love that style of hunting. We hunt water sources, tight creeks, and even a few, dead cow carcasses, trying to capitalize on boars before the season ends and the wet season rains landlock the countryside and prevent access. So that brings us, I think it's to sort of mid-2026 with all those films. I can't even remember how many I reeled off there, but there's something like 20 films probably in the works. A lot of them are actually all scheduled on YouTube, ready to go. And then following that, we will be releasing 12 films from the USA saga, which you've just heard and listened to over the last few weeks. So that includes this very podcast on mule deer stalks, and you will see all of the action from the 2025 Bugle September period in America on the Twin Elements YouTube channel. So make sure that you guys subscribe. Once again, we have so much epic content coming your way. I'm super, super excited about it, and I know you guys will be too. Next on the agenda, heading into Christmas, James and we are doing a mega 20% off sale on all prints across the Twin Elements website. Our sale ends on Boxing Day, December 26, 2025. So please use code TWIN10, TWIN20, for 20% off, the perfect gift for a friend or family member this holidays. They make great gifts. We're obviously a little bit biased, and James and I obviously greatly appreciate your support, whether that's, watching our YouTube film, simply commenting on Instagram, buying a print, you name it. We really, really appreciate it. So on that note, also, if you guys need some last minute gift guides or gift ideas for Christmas, then please make sure to come back here to the Twin Elements podcast next week as I sit down and dive into our Twin Elements 10 must-have items for either yourself, a family member, or a Christmas friend, or a friend this festive season, we give some tips into buying a great gift this Christmas season. Last thing from me, please continue to subscribe, review, and rate the podcast. James and I truly appreciate your support. That's it. That's all. Thank you, legends. I will see you next week on the Twin Elements podcast. Take it easy.